where you don't, you can't envision. There are all sorts of opportunities that kind of avail themselves that you don't envision, you don't see. By the same token, because I can't see it, I can't just assume that it's there. The light at the end of the tunnel might be a moving bus, or it could be a light. Often it's a moving bus. And even the best of intentions don't necessarily have the best of outcomes. I mean, you might have had the Chuck Todds of the world or the Tappers of the world, or people who are in mainstream media thinking we're fighting, this tyrant. In their heads, they could have actually thought that. This kind of, it's our job to do X or it's our job to do Y as opposed to just report the news. This guy is a monster. We need to do something about it. No, I think I don't know where it turns. I mean, basically, you have two political parties. Both have basically tried to undermine governance in this country. Obama was doing it through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We were also doing it from the standpoint of Russiagate. And they acted as if Russiagate wasn't going to have consequences because it wasn't a direct attack on the electoral system. Instead, it was an attack on the candidate and on people. Because their argument was that people, Americans, were so lemmings. Like, if you remember, blacks were led by the Russians because of the gun violence in the country. It had nothing to do with 1,000 killings a year. With like little to no responsibility, or the climate movement was led by these guys by the Russians because people didn't care about climate. Like, it's obscene, and they acted as if they keep hitting Trump on that and keep saying you didn't win, you didn't win, you didn't win, and undermining the presidency and make it look as if Trump didn't get on his own power. That somehow that would translate, and it did translate. It translated to 10 million more votes because the public didn't care. And it also translated into Donald Trump potentially. I mean, it depends. We don't know. He might have did this anyway. But definitely coming up with a rationale that can point and say, you guys did this to me. This is fair game. The difference being he's attacking the electoral system outright. Look, I don't know where this goes, if I'm being honest. And it seems like I don't know where it stops. Think of it for yourself. Does Trump and the Republican Party have enough money to do astroturfs across the United States? Basically saying the election was stolen. Yes. And if they're doing these astroturfs, despite Twitter and despite Facebook, does it make it look as if Twitter and Facebook are in on it, if Twitter and Facebook are censoring the information and everything else? By the same token, if they don't censor it, you also allow basically a platform for it. Like, this, I don't know the out. Does that make sense? Like, if you're going to be hard and say, okay, I'm going to stop you from saying this, you're going to run afoul of the First Amendment, but you're also going to run afoul of people saying you're trying to hold information. If you put it all out, well, at that point, Trump just gets his leeway. He gets a certain degree of legitimacy, and you have to deal with him from a standpoint of, look, that's not true, and so forth. But whether it's true or not almost becomes irrelevant. That's what I'm saying about Russiagate. The truth was irrelevant. It was there to serve a political objective. And the same thing is true with this, where you have some people who don't care whether you won or lost. They just want the argument to exist, where they can make this case and take power. What do you think? I mean, I think that's what this is.
We should come back to this. We have our guest on at this point. This is a longer conversation. I would want to talk about the AstroTurf thing. I mean, you keep saying that, but as far as I can tell, there's a lot of organic protests going on out there. I know some of the people. I've met some of the people. Hell, who founded the Stop the Steal thing. I think they've gone pretty crazy. Just looking at it, frankly, talking about being willing to fight for. For every last drop of blood or whatever, that's obscene. There was one sort of euphemistic word for it in any event. We should come back to that, talk about it some other time later on in the show. We have our guest on, Vasudevan Sridharan. I just want to check with you actually right up front. Did I get that pronunciation okay, Vasudevan?
Yeah, that's fine.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Vasudevan Sridharan is an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications. Specifically, we're talking about an article of his over in the South China Morning Post, scmp.com. Vasudevan, thank you for joining us. We had a guest on last week who was talking to us about these protests, and I'm thinking we're going to see how this goes. I'm guessing this interview will sort of be a compare and contrast with that interview. He was broadly a fan of Modi, and in that sense, I think that he might have been slightly trying to diminish the protests. Anyway, I want to hear from you on this as well. 250 million. That's the number of people who engaged in a one-day strike, but that's the number that keeps getting thrown around. The total number of people protesting in India. let's just start with that. Is that number accurate? We can get into the details of the bills that they're responding to, where they are situated, what parts of the country they're coming from. But let's just start with a number. How many people would you estimate to be out there protesting in India total?
Honestly, it's quite difficult to estimate the accurate number, but we can give a broad range. Definitely, it could be more than 200 million. I don't think it's they may not be on the street, but they could be protesting somewhere or other. So definitely, it's no less than 200 million, easily.
That's astonishing. I mean, the numbers are mind-blowing.
Yeah,
They really are.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, what are
very-
they there? What are they protesting for? I mean, what's the main thrust? Two questions on this one, I guess, but both of them the same question. Why did the protest start, and what did it escalate to? Because protests always have a tendency to escalate, especially when you have that many people that are out there, and each person can look at the other person and realize, hey, we got something real here. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's not like one person standing up and wondering, okay, am I right? Do I have the crowd with me? No. These guys have the crowd, 200 million people. So what was the impetus for the protests, and what did it escalate or evolve to?
Okay, let's get a brief background on how it works. In India, agriculture sector is heavily regulated by the government, whether in terms of purchasing of farmland, or the fertilizer subsidies, the power supply subsidies, the water supply, or where a farmer can sell his produce in terms of crops, and or how much he or she can sell it for. All these are regulated by the government, both by the central and the state governments. In September, the central government, New Delhi, wanted to loosen its grip on the agriculture sector. They wanted to deregulate most of these. They wanted to bring in the private players to operate. Both, there are two things. One, how in terms the output, the produce, they want to involve the private players who can purchase, or where the farmers can sell it to. The other part is who can make contracts, who can decide on what crops they can grow. This entry of, they enacted like 3 laws, and 2 of them are largely okay, but they're still controversial. But the one singular most important contentious law which rubbed the farmers is the first one, which almost liberalized the entire agriculture sector. That's pretty much. They don't want the private players to be given a free hand by the government. That's pretty much the most important bone of contention between the farmers and the government. This was enacted in September, when India is still struggling with the pandemic. So they took some time. The farmers took some time to study the proposals, and then to galvanize to where it does come now. That's pretty much it.
So in our conversation we had last week, 2 main things come back up to me, and I want to talk. Got to go into a break in a minute or two. I want to talk on the other side of the break, possibly about where these protests are situated, if there is a regional basis for them. But you brought up a couple of things, a couple of bases for the protests. You brought up the history of price floors on the sales of agricultural goods. Specifically, I think it was wheat, and it may have been rice along with wheat. I know you'll be able to correct me on this.
Yeah, wheat and rice.
Yes, wheat and rice. And he also brought up these APMCs, Agricultural Produce Market Committees, basically local markets or marketing boards set up by the government that farmers would come to sell their goods. How are those being affected? How are those 2 factors being affected by September's farm bills?
Okay, the second one is they are locally called mandis, APMCs. What the farmers can do is they can bring the produce to these locally set up wholesale markets, and they can auction it. They cannot directly sell it via the government. So the government will assure a minimum price, regardless. That's set well before the harvest season, not after. So the government will on most crops. So so they have some assured purchase from the government, and then they will be sold to either traders or middlemen or other private players. Now that's being abolished. So the latest law, according to the latest law, the private players can directly purchase all these produce from the farmers. So this is not going well with the farmers. So they say in the long run, they will start exploiting these farmers because they don't have a huge say in what they can produce.
Okay, Vasudevan, let's go into a break. You're listening to the voice of Vasudevan Sridharan. He is an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications. And you're also listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us to explain the Indian strike. It's utterly fascinating in regards to its historic proportions. Vasudevan Sridharan, an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, environment, startups, and economy. His work has appeared in several Indian and geopolitical or global publications. Sridharan, again, thank you for joining us. I appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, I'm glad.
Let me ask you this. From the standpoint of the Modi government and, let's say, the Hindu equation of this, how does this relate to the farmers? Like, is there a split among economic versus ideological lines in the farmers, or do we have a situation where the Hindu group, let's say the BJP, are basically in line with him? Because I would imagine some BJP has to be farmers too. I mean, is there like this kind of weird economic division, economic conflict within the context of the group? Or is this falling along party lines where the BJP line up behind Modi and the farmers are kind of doing their own thing? How does this work in practice?
On the ground level, I don't think ideology plays a huge role in this context. This is purely a subject of economy, because some of the farmers' unions or organizations which are in different parts of India, which are closely aligned with the Modi government or its ideological fountainhead called RSS. They also have difference of opinions with the three laws, although they haven't taken to the streets to protest against. They haven't joined the strike. Some of them are major. They haven't explicitly joined the strike, but they still have expressed difference of opinion with the government. So ideology plays a lesser part, particularly in this aspect. So by and large, the farmers across India are in chorus against this government. Apart from very, very few voices which are in support of the government, we hear from questionable sources.
So that makes sense from the standpoint of basically this goes into an economic issue. This goes beyond just the individual issues of the individual groups. What effect are they going to have? I mean, with this many people, has the Modi government responded. I mean, the Yellow Vest movement, Macron had to respond, and there was nowhere near as many people
Yeah.
on the streets.
Yeah. Well, it's already unprecedented how the Modi government has responded so far. Usually, in the last 6 or 7 years, including the first term, whatever controversial implementation, whether it's a legislation or a new policy which is being implemented, whenever there is a street protest or any kind of opposition, the usual practice is the New Delhi government officials do not engage with the protesters directly. That's usually the case. When Kashmir's special status was revoked, or one of the controversial laws called the Citizenship Amendment Act was introduced or amended, there was very similar, not like these proportions, what we are seeing right now in the farmers' case. But we did have major protests going on. At that time, no senior government official engaged in talks. They refused to engage in the first place. But this is entirely different. Right now, they are talking to the farmers. They've had about 7 or 8 rounds of talks already. The Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, who was the former BJP president, he is directly engaging in talks with these farmers. That's almost unheard of. You never see someone of. He's pretty much India's number 2 most powerful person. You never ever see Mr. Amit Shah indulging in talks with any of his opponents, political or otherwise, in such scenarios, especially when there's a huge protest going on. So they are taking these farmers' protests seriously. It is going to. They do fear that it might come to bite in the back. That's pretty evident.
I'm curious. So I want to talk about what groups, where the organization for these protests are coming from, because hundreds of millions of people out on the streets, hundreds of millions of people protesting, some fraction of those people striking. That is an organizational effort of mammoth proportions. So I'm curious about that. But first, I want to talk about, is there a regional center for this? Our last guest who we had on to talk about this issue last week was telling us that these protests are primarily based in and restricted to the region of Punjab in northern India. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is. They are, because most likely they will be the most affected. Okay, there's a minor regional difference between northern and southern India. In most southern states, the farmers are not full-time farmers. They engage in farming activities only between 3 and 5 months when there is a harvest season, and they have other jobs during the other months. But in most northern Indian states, they are full-time farmers. They are throughout the year because they have farming activities going on around the year. So there will be exceptions, but this is a larger picture. So there will be some kind of difference in how the southern states are protesting. So that's there. The Punjab is definitely accurate because the state will be the most affected. Almost what we spoke about, the minimum support price. Punjab is getting from the federal government between 21 and 38%, depending on the harvest season. So they are the beneficiaries. They are the major beneficiaries. Even the second and third largest states, like I guess Andhra, another state, they are far behind. Even they are put together, they don't get as much benefits as Punjab. So the farmers in Punjab will be the most affected. So obviously they are the most outraged. That's accurate, yeah.
You know, I am fascinated by this protest. I mean, Shane makes a really good point about the organization and what does it take, you know what I mean, to get this number of people out and rallied behind a particular cause. I suppose this just gets into the notion of how significant this is in regards to Indian society, right? I mean, the fact that you can have this many people out has to cut across all sorts of lines. I mean, you're talking about like a sixth of the population of the country basically on the streets, supposedly. Yeah. And so, you know, I would imagine the government has to pay attention to that. When are the next elections coming around for India, by the way?
The central parliamentary elections is in 2024. So we just had elections but the last year, 2019. So that's still far away. But the state elections are due in mid 21, next year. So April or May, we will have 5 states and union territories facing elections. So this will play a role in determining the outcome.
Do you think that Modi is going to be able to withstand this race?
Sorry, I get the question?
Well, I was just asking, do you think Modi will be able to withstand the election? I mean, given what's taking place now.
It's hard to tell because whatever challenges he had faced so far, he did have controversial policies implemented, for example, the demonetization, but they didn't have a voter base. But when it comes to farmers, they can vote as a bloc. They can vote as a single voice. But they are the BJP is a battle-hardened party. Modi is well aware of his electoral chances. They have played their cards extremely well in most domestic elections, despite the mounting challenges. They will be able to withstand in some cases, but it will be extremely hard for them in this case. It's going to make their job very difficult. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you again for being with us. I kind of want to come back to the organizational capacity here and what exactly is behind this. I just real quick, very brief clarification. This and the protest that took place earlier this year in January. These would both be considered a Bharat Bandh, right? A shutting down, sort of wider strike protest.
Yes, but the earlier one is not as big as this one. That's for a different purpose and definitely not as big as this. In this case, yes, the organizational capacity is we don't have a single union or organization, farmers union across India, but the various states have extensive farmers union and organizations in some part. So now with the advent of social media, WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups, communities, they are able to organize it pretty well. We see some phenomenally innovative practices, especially in Punjab, how we are reading reports and hearing from our known sources how people in the US or the NRI community, non-residential Indian community in both Northern America or in Canada or other places, they are how bankrolling some of these protests. Remember, they are not vested interests. They are relatives and friends of in the farmers who are in Punjab. So we are seeing some innovative practices, yes.
That is interesting. So I mean, for just as a for instance, a guest that we had on last week, we were actually talking to about Sikh protests taking place in San Francisco in solidarity with the protests going on in Punjab and across India. We've got maybe 30, 45 seconds left. I'm curious, the protests in January earlier this year, last I checked, were organized by around 10 unions. It seems like these protests are union organized as well. Is there a sort of national coalition of unions? How powerful, just briefly, are unions in the Indian political space? Is this a sort of new height in terms of their political power, or is this the status quo for them?
Not in terms of the political power, but in terms of, let's say, flexing the muscle to send a political message. They don't have a political stance as set or an electoral capacity, but yes, it is sending a strong message in terms of organizing of this proportion. Definitely, yes.
Very interesting. Thank you for joining us, Vasudevan.
Thanks to you both. Bye.
We were joined there by Vasudevan Sridharan, experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations in the environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America. Welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
But Jamarl,
Yeah.
before you go into headlines, I just have a quick question here. I almost just heard you do it again. I'm very curious. Is there a story behind the divided states of New York thing?
No. I'm doing multiple things at once because YouTube, because Google went down. Everything that I have is basically down, and so it's like pulling up all of the articles, pulling up all of the channel stuff, making sure that the OBS and everything is straight. It's just doing multiple things at once, and so it's like
I hear you.
Yeah, it's just trying to manage a bunch of stuff. No, it's divided states of America. New York might
totally.
be this kind of weird subjective thing in my head that represents America. Who knows? I don't know.
Andre
it was just a
just
mistake.
gave me a very credible explanation there, which is your password.
I wish.
Is
I
New-
wish. No,
New
it's just
York.
everything is shut down.
Which is
And it's like, it feels like a rush because it's like you're trying to catch up with everything. I got to be honest. If it wasn't for our producers, we would have been up it this morning. So shout out to the team for making this work. But
Up
let's get to the
Scrap Creek
headlines.
with hands for paddles. Yeah, man.
Yeah, I know, right?
Not
I
a good
know.
place to be.
All right, so let's get to the headlines. In the news, the first of nearly 3 million doses of COVID vaccine were sent out across the United States yesterday, marking the start of the most ambitious vaccination campaign in the nation's history. Early on Sunday, the first boxes of a vaccine developed by Pfizer and BioNTech that received emergency approval from federal regulators were packed in dry ice at Pfizer plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Workers applauded as the first trucks left the plant, the earliest wave of vaccines bound for distribution sites across all 50 states. The first doses will go to healthcare workers who could start receiving shots by Monday. Residents of the nursing home, who have suffered a disproportionate share of COVID deaths, are also being prioritized and are expected to begin vaccinations next week. Hospitals rush to set up injection sites, and workers track each shipment hour by hour. If I am not mistaken, in fact, I'm not mistaken, there was a report out that the Trump administration was going to get White House officials also vaccinated, and apparently that's been scuttled. I don't know if it was the public pressure about it or what, but it's being scuttled. A president basically didn't want to wear a mask, also now wants his team vaccinated. I think that's where the problem comes in. More than a quarter of deaths above normal this year have been from other causes than COVID-19, including a 15% rise in deaths from diabetes, 13% from Alzheimer's, 11% from high blood pressure and pneumonia. This is according to New York Times analysis of estimates from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. It's thought that many of these excess deaths were caused either by less willingness to seek out medication from groups with relevant conditions or a lack of options for treatment, particularly in the case of victims of Alzheimer's disease, many of which would have been in nursing homes. That is an exceptional point. And I think both of those stories piggyback on each other. When COVID-19 started to first make news, 42% of the deaths were in nursing homes. Think about that. 42% of the deaths in like 1% of the population. I don't even think it's that much. And so you get the magnitude of the severity for people who are either in nursing homes or working in nursing homes. Add to that hospitals being ransacked. You're talking about 3,000 cases a day. You're talking about ICUs being full. So if your ICUs are full, if you're concerned about getting COVID, my mom is not taking my grandmother to the hospital at this point. She's concerned that her health will decline as a result of being there. I would imagine a lot of people it's not just the hospitals are full, it's also that those hospitals are full and people have feelings about bringing people to those hospitals where they believe either the elderly or themselves could get ill. Like, it's not just the COVID. It goes beyond the COVID. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, I try to make the point to people that when there are one of the reasons I have such animosity against people who are pushing back against the science of this stuff is that I know the consequences. There will be excess deaths, and it's not just excess deaths in COVID. It's going to spread out. How many people couldn't get to the ER or didn't go to the ER because they thought they might have had a cold? Maybe they didn't want to get it checked. Maybe they felt bad, but they didn't necessarily want to take the chance of going to the hospital where they couldn't be around family members. Like, there are a litany of reasons that could explain this that are related to COVID, but it's not COVID specifically. What do you think, Shane?
This is an opportunity to learn, but we're not gonna. So, I mean, if we, I'll put it like this. If we had the sense about us to prevent this thing from spreading in the United States, and at the same time we saw it ravaging much of the rest of the world, what we could have done in response to that with our good sense was to be like, hey, if we have an outbreak like this, what we should develop is a nationwide system of at-home care where through, electronic systems and through the delivery of necessary medicine, people in their home have access to life-saving care. So that if we have a pandemic like this, sometime in the 2020s or the 2030s, 2040s, however long it takes, and we're probably gonna, just statistically speaking, we will be equipped to handle it. Now, we could have had that thought process this year. We could have had that thought process a decade or two ago. Arguably, the tech is getting better, and so it's more feasible this year. But the institutions seem to be not getting better. They seem to be getting more stagnant and sclerotic. So I don't see us having that conversation soon. But the same good sense that would have helped us to avert this pandemic catastrophe would also have helped us to prepare in that way. And the reason I'm putting it in those terms is if we had those at hand and we were dealing with the pandemic, think about how many more lives would have been saved. And I don't know what the cost would be, but I can't help but think that being able to avert an economic lockdown and sheerly in pure calculus, GDP terms, economic terms, the GDP potential of all those people who wouldn't have died should have been worth the cost. I mean, every person's worth, I don't even know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars in lifetime GDP potential last I checked. So literally, sheerly in terms of the cold, brutal economic calculus, it would have been worth it for us to do the R&D, but apparently we just don't have our wits about us. Apparently we don't have the good sense to do so. Anyway, that's my long-winded take.
No, that's God, I'm glad you went that way, because think of 9/11. 3,000 people died on 9/11, in addition to, let's say, $1 trillion in damage. How many people have died from COVID just on one day?
Every day.
Every day.
That's the thing. I've seen these statistics so here's the thing, that I've seen people sharing these statistics on Facebook and other social media platforms, where if you look at the top 10 historic days in American history in terms of the number of people who died from a specific cause, at least 3 or 4 of them at this point are COVID. And before long, every single one of them is going to be in a single day due to a single cause, which is the spread of the coronavirus. It's shocking. I mean, we could talk about what I was just talking about. I kind of want to come back at some point to the topic of how much better we would have done if we had, and I'm going to say it like this, if we had rushed a successful vaccine through its trial phase and started to distribute it to some of the sectors of the public that needed it, how many hundreds of thousands of lives that would have saved? How many people would have been killed in the vaccine trial? Like a handful by current accounts of how efficacious they are? How many people might have gotten Bell's palsy? Assuming that is, and I'm not, frankly, but just let's assume for a second that that's one of the side effects of taking this thing. A handful. How many people's lives would have been saved? I don't even know how many tens of thousands. So in terms of cost-benefit calculations, it's shocking to me that our establishment doesn't have its head on its shoulders and can't see that it should have done that. But I'm speaking into the wind here. I know most folks probably disagree with me on that one. Anyway.
Well, I think the problem is, from their standpoint, human health, it's not the point. The point is profits. I honestly, I understand where you're coming from, that if you look at it and you accumulate, how much value does a human being have? You can make those accumulations every day, Shane. Like that calculus, when you're saying, okay, the overwhelming majority of the world lives off $10 a day. If they didn't live off $10 a day, if they could get the education, if they had the healthcare, if they had the resources and we invested in them, how much would they be worth? Well, ungodly sums of money. The issue is who profits? Cui bono, right? And this kind of who profit stuff, the people, the public itself, it's not a valuable thing to keep that public alive, unless it's a valuable thing to keep the public alive. So I feel you. I totally get where you're coming from. I mean, the 9/11 calculus is a really good example. How much money did George Bush expend to use military? How much did it cost to get those ships over into the Middle East? How much did these companies make as a result of that war? Like, all of that costs. What, you're talking about $7 trillion, $10 trillion, something between that number? And look at what we did. We moved heaven and earth because we were very angry and we needed to punch somebody in the face and destroy multiple countries. But for COVID, that took more lives every day. We can't seem to get out of bed in the morning. It's just, it shows priorities. It's this Martin Luther King line where he makes the point about how the Great Society hit his head on the shores of Vietnam. It's like you expended all of this money into a war as opposed to tending to the needs of your population. And it gives us real clear indication of priorities. America needs to look at stuff in the mirror and ask some hard questions about this one, because this is not, this is embarrassing. Let's get back to headlines. Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post has reported that APT-29, which some intelligence communities have linked to Russian security services, have breached the Treasury and Commerce departments, along with other U.S. government agencies, through the update server of a network management system called SolarWinds. The National Security Council reportedly convened an emergency meeting to discuss the breach on Sunday. NSC spokesman John Uliot said that they, quote, are aware of these reports, and we're taking all necessary steps to identify and remedy all possible issues related to the situation, unquote. The alleged hack comes from reports last week that FireEye, a major U.S. cybersecurity firm, had been attacked by a, quote, nation with top-tier offensive capabilities, unquote, which was said to have made off with its internal hacking tools. FireEye did not attribute the attack to APT-29, although Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post did later that same day. Shane, I'm going to give you this because you explained this extremely well, that this is not what they're saying it is. They're basically escalating something that they don't know to be true, kind of like the Russian hacks and breached the account. And then you later find out the CEO from CrowdStrike basically says, yeah, we don't know that to be true. We don't even know who did it. So explain, Shane.
Like you're saying. He said we have a moderate level of confidence. Who the heck knows what that even means? I mean, there are a couple of different angles we can come at this one from. Cybersecurity companies, as well as the intelligence agencies of various states, have an incentive to blame other countries in some sense, particularly countries that are already our enemies. Because if you look at it, it's kind of embarrassing if you just get hacked by some random hacker. And so on the one hand, you elevate the level of concern to the highest level possible. And it's a very scary foreign actor who's doing this. When you look at the evidence they have for assuming that it's a foreign actor, it's scant. When you look at, for instance, what is an advanced persistent threat, APT-29, they assume that it's a specific group of people, but they don't know that. They're assuming that a specific group of people somewhere in the world, that they're assuming in Russia, has come up with a variety of malware attacks. The problem is once that malware is available, it's available online. Anybody can use it. Anybody can rent out the servers that these supposed groups are using to breach various places. Another way to criticize this, I'm just going to quote again from our last paragraph here. We got more headlines, but FireEye said that this came from a, quote, nation with top-tier offensive capabilities, end quote. Literally, if you go over to the Wikipedia page for APT-29, you'll see that one of their first breaches, if you assume that this is a group, one of their first breaches, in fact, the first breach that's listed on that website, is like a spear phishing attack using a flash video of monkeys in an office, where, you click on the monkeys, it infects you with malware, and they have you at that point. That's not that sophisticated sounding. Spear phishing, which is apparently most of how they've done it, is how this alleged group, what is alleged to be a group, got access to the White House, was through a spear phishing attack where a White House employee opened up an email and logged in with the wrong credentials using a broken link, basically. That's not that complicated. I mean, it takes a bit of effort to spoof a website, and maybe to spoof the emails, and you've got to do a couple of things, but it's not like you're like spending days on the command line coding up something from scratch. It's not that complicated. So it's this weird contradiction in the level of abilities, and it's this, frankly, like a gap in how exactly they're choosing to choosing to claim that it's this group. Anyway, we could go into it more, and I kind of want to get some guests on because it's clear that this is going to be an ongoing issue, and they're probably going to use this December report to justify more sanctions, whatever the case may be. But yeah, again, the December, right after an election that I think that held in 2018, 2016, and probably hold in 2022 and 2024, assuming nothing changes. Anyway, Jamarl.
Let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Line. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to get to the protesters one. We probably can talk about it a little bit more full-throatedly, either with Garland or in the next break. But there's a UFO one that actually corresponds to this too. Gary McKinnon. I don't know if you know that name. Gary McKinnon lived in the UK. Gary McKinnon goes to NASA because he's heard about UFOs and heard that NASA basically has pictures on their server. So he's like, hey, I'm curious. He breaks into NASA's server. Now, what he says, he was like, it's a command line. Like, it wasn't anything. It was just like a password. Like, I put in password, and it lets me in. And if it wasn't for the stuff being so long, I would have downloaded some of the pictures. Now, you could discount him, except the Obama administration was trying to get him deported into the United States to put him in prison. And it took the Cameron administration to tell Obama, no. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Reed. We're joined for this segment by our guest, Wyatt Reed. He's a Sputnik News analyst and producer for the show By Any Means Necessary, which airs on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday, excluding federal holidays and other truly exceptional exceptions. The show, again, airs on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. You can follow Wyatt, by the way, on Twitter at Wyatt Reed 13. That is Wyatt with a Y, as is the standard spelling. You can also listen to him on By Any Means Necessary, again, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern on Radio Sputnik. Wyatt, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself? Good.
Better for having you. I hear you were out at the protests on Saturday out in D.C. I hear it got crazy. 4 people stabbed, 27 people arrested. First question up, did you get stabbed, and how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. I think mainly as a function of not having been stabbed, but yeah, I'm doing okay.
That is good. I'm just joshing a little bit. That is good to hear. It seriously was dangerous out there. What did you see?
Well, I saw quite a bit of violent confrontation. Speaking anecdotally, at least, from my perspective, the vast majority of the violence seemed to be coming from the Proud Boys, from the far right, many would say neo-fascist sort of street gang that has come to be known sort of for its violent confrontations in the street. Of course, the group gained quite a bit of notoriety in September after Donald Trump very publicly referred to them when he said, Proud Boys. Stand down and stand back. And of course, that led to widespread speculation that he was sort of encouraging them to play a role in something very much like what we're seeing right now. This extremely illusory accusations of electoral fraud that haven't really panned out in the courts, but have certainly panned out in the imaginations of his most fervent supporters. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. And the real sort of danger, I think, here lies in the fact that there was not, at least from the perspective of many of the organizers I spoke with, there was not sufficient police enforcement on these out-of-town, as they see them, sort of white nationalist groups. They were waving Confederate flags. They were yelling all sorts of profane things that bordered on extremely racist. Of course, a lot of high-profile videos coming out of Twitter this weekend. Proud Boys snatching Black Lives Matter signs off of businesses. Tactics that the police, engaged in fairly heavy-handed repression when they were engaged in by sort of left or Antifa-leaning forces. So we see a lot of concerns about kinds of double standards. Of course, the Proud Boys very infamously this weekend tore down the Black Lives Matter sign off the Ashbury Methodist Church. That's the city's oldest Black Methodist church. And there's, of course, a long history of far-right groups engaging in tactics that are racially unsavory, to say the very least. This, of course, does very little to dispel notions that they are somehow not a racist formation. So, quite a bit going on this weekend. And I'm happy to get into any of it more, as y'all see fit.
It's funny. I'm glad you said that. Because a lot of times they would say, oh, these Proud Boys, this has nothing to do with race. I mean, look at the Hispanic guy here. Look at this black guy here. And it's like, no, dude, let's be honest. What's interesting to me, though, and I don't think people entirely look at it in these terms, I often made the argument that Black Lives Matter is built on a certain degree of insecurity. I mean, why do you have to say Black Lives Matter if indeed everybody understood that they mattered, including you, and you thought that everybody thought? Proud Boys, oddly enough, is the same. I mean, why do you have to tell people that you're proud boys? And this, falls in line with this notion of where it may be white men feel like they've been set upon by various groups taking down statues and whatnot and pushing back against Confederate history and whatnot. And this is kind of the response to that. I'm curious on whether or not the speeches, was that implicit within the speeches and the communications that took place there? For example, did you have the opportunity to have conversations with some of the people there who were, I don't know, I know it sounds weird, but rioting or protesting, depending upon which time frame you're talking about, the election stuff?
I wouldn't frame them as discussions. Brief interactions, certainly, and mainly based on really my sort of inability to get very far with them. I think as a member of the media that's not already known to them and known to be on their side, they display a certain level of distrustfulness. I certainly don't blame them. I mean, if I held the same views as they did, I think that I would have reason to believe that the vast majority of people would find those views somewhat repulsive. So I certainly can sort of see where that mentality would come from. The one particular phrase that hangs out in my mind is they were. I'm not sure, optically how developed they are here, because at one point they started saying something about all you communists are going to effing hang when we come to power. And it wasn't even really clear if they were referring to media here or to anti-fascists or to just sort of bystanders. But that was kind of the sentiment, really, is that basically, anyone who isn't on our side is kind of part of this mass conspiracy to unseat the legitimately elected, as they see it, President Donald Trump. So, make of that what you will. I certainly seems like a pretty straightforward appeal to violence and a call for violence from my perspective. But, that's me.
And clearly, Wyatt, you are a Biden supporter, right? I mean, you oppose Donald Trump. You must like or love Joe Biden.
Well, this is something else. I actually I spoke more with the anti-fascist side about this, because there's kind of a tendency to describe the factions as politically partisan in that sense. But what I found is that there are much higher concentrations of people among the Black Lives Matter crowd and among the anti-fascist crowd of people who really have no faith and don't really participate meaningfully in electoral politics. On the right side, I think that far fewer of the people, that was the case for them. Generally speaking, those people were fired up about Donald Trump and they wanted him to be president. But certainly among the sort of left factions, I don't think that was really the case. Certainly there were a few people wearing Biden shirts and a handful of organizers who I spoke with who portrayed this as sort of a Trump versus Biden supporter event. But many of the people who I've seen out there are people who I've heard roundly criticize the Democratic Party time and time again, both in person and in terms of their social media presence. People who don't strike me as being terribly fooled by the lesser of two evil politics. So that's playing out in an interesting way. It's not really quite as straightforward as a lot of the media narratives would have us believe.
Yeah, and it's an aggravating media narrative. Before the election, I asked, why are they assuming that these guys are out there for Biden? Look, the resistance, quote unquote, are not the same people who would be out there fighting for somebody like you were fighting for yourself. Those guys were out there for Democrats. There's a difference in those things. Just because they, categorize themselves as the resistance. Well, the resistance was at home. Their guy won. The people who are out there now, people who are pushing back against what they consider a fascist push in the United States. And the Biden supporters of the world, the Obama-ites, the Clintonites, I don't for 1 minute believe they're out there at that protest, putting themselves on the line for the country. How do you see this? Because you were out there, you've been at all of these protests. Well, not all, but you know what I mean. You've been at a large share of these protests, and you've videotaped and filmed and kept track of this over the course of time. Are the resistance here? I mean, like you just said, this is not a Biden-Trump thing. This is like people who, on both sides, are skeptical and find it problematic in the way that the U.S. government has basically been run and organized. Meaning, both sides of this group are skeptical of government. Would that be fair? And if so, what do they want? I mean, I know you say you haven't had the opportunity to have discussions and so forth, but is it really just, we want Trump in power, that's it? Or are there other demands associated with these marches and protests? And by the way, are these AstroTurf?
Well, if you're talking about the Proud Boys side, I would imagine certainly more so than the level of astroturfing that I've seen around sort of local demonstrations. At least the left groups that I've seen are mostly broke, mostly depend on kind of the charity of solidarity of local businesses or just local individuals who feel compelled to help out in some way. I don't really get the sense that is the case with the Proud Boys, and of course there are a lot of questions still up in the air about where certain money that they get comes from. I hear the Mercier family name thrown out from time to time, but I'm not positive what the status is. The latest is on that kind of investigation. In terms of the kind of political dynamic, whether or not they really adhere to the two-party system, I would say you saw from the Proud Boys actually pretty overt willingness to kind of throw the Republican Party under the bus, and really the perspective was that we must essentially sacrifice the Senate in Georgia to teach the Republican Party a lesson about, how important it is to maintain the sort of firm anti-immigrant position. So, that's actually It took me a little bit by surprise, but
It didn't take me by surprise at all.
Stronger condemnation of
Wyatt, that didn't take me by surprise at all.
Sorry.
We're going to have to close it out, but I'm just going to say that didn't take me by surprise at all. If you go back and look at the election when Trump was getting elected, there's a scene where Ted Cruz, grandstanding, stands out in front of a crowd of Trump supporters. And they're like, we don't believe in you. We believe in Trump. And he gets across in very clear terms that this is not the thing of we like the Republican Party. And it also explains why many of these Republicans haven't come out. I keep telling people this. It's not that they love him. They know that there will be a political consequence if they do. I mean, the group out there kind of makes that point clear. Wyatt, dude, thank you for joining us, man. We always appreciate you coming on. You always give us a really good rundown of the protests and the marches and those type of things, not to mention South America. So Wyatt Reed is a Sputnik news analyst and producer for By Any Means Necessary, which airs on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday, 2 to 4 p.m. You can also follow Wyatt on Twitter at WyattReed13 and listen to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. We will be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any.
Mel Garland.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and definitely share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We are also, just to be clear, in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you are in the area for either Washington, D.C. or Kansas City, you can definitely listen to us on radio. I want to get to, this is going to be a call-in segment, so definitely feel free to call in, give your take, give your opinion, your engagement, makes the show what it is. And we say that not in this kind of perfunctory way, we say that in real terms. We really do enjoy the back and forth. I want to talk about AOC. Now, there's been a huge, to call it a freak out, it's to put it mildly. On the left, there's been this push to try to get AOC and the squad to basically not back Pelosi in the leadership contest. The thought being, if Pelosi wants to be leader of the House again after all of the losses, then maybe Pelosi needs to give something up, and maybe you need to use leverage for that. Meaning, there's a slim margin that Pelosi will be able to use to win the election. And that margin, if you're talking about the Progressive Caucus and the number of people that supposedly is in the Progressive Caucus, well, that should be enough to do exactly what is being said. Meaning, if you want to be Speaker of the House, you need to put Medicare for all up for a vote. Now, AOC is basically saying, that's a bad idea, and I don't want to do it. And many of the left is saying, why is it a bad idea? Why don't you want to do it? From my standpoint, it seems like a lot of this should have been done before the election, even though the political pressure is against it doing it before the election, because the fact of the matter is your leverage is more. Right now, the argument that they're basically making is saying, hey, AC and the squad, use the leverage that you guys have in the Democratic Party to do X and hold them accountable. I'm making the point that I'm asking, is that leverage more pronounced before the election or after? And the moment that you get after the election, you are at that point, to some degree, at the whims of the candidate, unless you can find ways of accentuating leverage. Now, you may think, hey, maybe she's concerned about the consequences. But think about it for a moment. What consequences are she concerned about? That they're going to call you racist, sexist, bigoted, and uniquely aggressive towards women? They've already done that. What are they going to call you? They're going to say you're brazenly, they're going to brazenly cheat you like they did in 2016. Donald Brazil has already mentioned that. How about brazenly cheat you in 2020? Oh, right. The media just reported that over the weekend, that the Iowa Democratic Party basically cheated. You have this other thing where it's like, so what do you expect them to end the way you can engage with the party? Well, the DSCC, the DCCC, basically put in policy to keep people like AOC out of the party. I mean, there's a list of these. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, at what point do you try to use leverage to attenuate to your political wants and your political will? And if you're in the pandemic with this many Democrats that back Medicare for all, and you don't even have the gumption to get them to bring it up for a vote, oh my God, then what is the point? We have a caller. Shane, I want to get your point of view. Do you want to get to the callers first, or you want to give your take?
We've got a couple of open segments here by appearances. We've got plenty of time from my point of view and yours. I want to get to the callers first off.
So let's go to
we
Tarif.
have two. Yeah, let's go to Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
I got 3 comments before I say my comments. At least the left is starting to wake up, like the right is starting to wake up, pushing back against the politicians. I'm glad y'all waking up now. So, okay, my 3 comments. Donald Trump over the weekend, we tweeted someone saying at this point, real Donald Trump should declassify everything. And Donald Trump responded, I have been doing this, I agree. That's my first comment. Second comment is dealing with the John F. Kennedy National Security Memorandum 57, which takes the take covert activities away from the CIA and give it to the DOJ. It becomes activated January the 5th to say Trump. The dog journalist said Trump already signed it. So, and also my last comment is dealing with it is okay. This morning at 8:30. I think y'all time or Central Time, I don't know, that the judge should rule that the forensics team looking at the machines in Michigan might go public and say what happened to the machines. If that happened, if something happened to the machines that was illegal, if it was hacked, then what I was talking about Friday, the act, the 2018 Executive Act might become activated, then you might have further investigation, So yeah, that's all I want to say.
Well, here's the thing: which foreign actor are you talking? Because the got a couple of things in response here, and thank you for the call. But the executive order you were talking about, signed back in I believe it was September of 2018, is about foreign interference by another nation, by foreign interference in our election. Which is the foreign agent that's interfering here? Would it be Germany because the Dominion servers are there? Are you taking up the Sidney Powell line that somehow Venezuela is involved? What's your take here, Tarif?
Well, when you look at the executive order, it's very broad. They mean by foreign actor, they didn't specifically say North Korea, Iran, Russia, or China, or Venezuela. They said foreign actor outside the United States. So that would curtail even allies. I think the Spain, Portugal, Germany. So that means that it would, I feel to believe, in my opinion, legal expertise, that it might activate that executive order. But I could be wrong. We'll see this morning what happened.
Yeah, I hear you. I guess it depends on where you're coming from. I don't buy Sidney Powell's theory, and I don't buy the Dominion thing as far as I can tell. But like you're saying, we'll see here. I mean, another side of this is that Dominion, the company, is headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. Not headquartered on foreign soil. Definitely wouldn't constitute foreign interference.
I thought they were in Germany or somewhere.
Well, no. Anyway, one other point: the thing that you mentioned, Donald Trump, like retweeting the dude about releasing everything, declassifying everything. That would be fascinating. And that's my kind of a Hail Mary move here. But I'm not sure, Trump only has so much time left. I'm not sure what everything actually means. I'm not sure if he'll go through with that. Talk about releasing the JFK files. Not sure if he'll do that, but here's to hoping, certainly.
He should, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, if he feels that aggrieved, where he would basically say, I didn't lose this election. And honestly, part of me even thinks, is it possible that this is kind of like Mike Tyson slapping your wife or your girlfriend stuff? Like, if you're walking, Mike Tyson hits your girlfriend, what do? Are you going to fight Mike Tyson immediately because he hit your girlfriend? Or are you going to be like, man, if it wasn't for these people holding me back, Mike, I would, is it that? Meaning Trump believes, I don't believe for a moment that they're going to keep me in office, so I have every ability in the world to push for this notion that I won. It's even crossed my mind if it was that. He knows he lost. It doesn't really matter. He doesn't want to accept it. He just assumes that the American public is not going to keep him in office, or that the structures of the country, infrastructure-wise, are strong enough to withstand it. But I got to be honest, I don't entirely know if that's true. Like, a lot of this stuff could be going around the seams. But look, I do believe that Trump should release those files. If there is something to this notion of Trump and Russia, he should release it. If there's something about, the other information about the JFK, yes, release it. I'm for that. And by the way, if there is something wrong with the machines, release it. I don't want to live in a country if indeed there is persistent and entrenched fraud. So this is not from a perspective of somebody who's saying, I don't want to know the truth if the truth is there. This is me saying, if Donald Trump has the goods, he should put the goods out. And up to this point, I've seen squat, despite the fact that this is the thing that he's trying to stay in power on. Anthony from Detroit. Anthony, what's going on, man?
Hey, what's up, y'all? Glad to be on again. I just wanted to come on and talk about the whole AOC Jimmy Dore debacle. I mean, I don't want to take up too much airtime, and because Jamarl, you already do a good job. You guys been, of course, you too, Shane. Both do a good job of making the necessary points, like the fact that any argument that AOC ought not to do this, about like any argument that it's better if she bide her time and do something else to get these particular committee appointments is really just BS, because just thinking, you can just reduce it down to thinking logically. Nancy Pelosi, once you accept that her vested interests are opposed fundamentally to us as a movement, then she will never do anything that will really truly be to the gain of us as a movement, i.e. put AOC in any real position of power, or any of the progressive quote unquote squad. But I think where this conversation should go to really be productive is us. Similar to in 2019, the other points that you and Jimmy Dore also make, Jamarl, are that this has happened before, and Jimmy Dore constantly is saying Blue Dog Democrats have done this before, literally in the last speaker vote. So it's not that strange, but when it comes to a progressive doing it, it's immediately, oh no, you can't do that because you're agitating too much, and we need to just bide our time. We need to always just bide our time. So I think instead of calling, of course we need to call on AOC, but I think the majority of, as far as effort on the media level and in order to remain less divisive and more productive on the left, I think if we call for specific groups to put that pressure on AOC rather than focus on characters like Jimmy Dore, which because he's already so heavily maligned by the Sam Cedar group. Yeah. I think if we focus on specific organizations like we saw with the Justice Democrats and a couple of other organizations in 2019, and if we call on them to put the pressure on AOC and specifically Nancy Pelosi, I think that might be a bit more productive. And I also, last comment, I'll hop off, I really think you should have Vosh on. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but his audience has a large overlap with the Sam Cedar crowd, and even engaging in ideas like this is immediately kind of a non-starter, because that audience is so whipped into complicity for the Democratic establishment.
Oh,
and
God, they're costed. They're the worst of the groups. Yeah, the Cedars of the world. The funny part about that is these Cedar works on MSNBC. There's clearly a tether between MSNBC and Sam Cedar, or at the very least it used to. He's part of a creature of the Democratic Party. I'll give you a perfect example of this. If you remember Keith Olbermann used to work on MSNBC. Olbermann used to be big against George Bush. Big, massive. He used to give these monologues and everything else. He's the one who started that notion of MSNBC being in the Democratic Party. When what's her name comes out, Donna Brazile comes out and basically said he cheated Sanders. What did Olbermann say in this? What do you think Olbermann said? I mean, is he shocked about the cheating? Is he, perturbed by it? Is he bothered that the Democratic Party would do something so radically undemocratic? No. His response was, you've just sold your career. Basically, you've just gave up your career. Had nothing to do with the cheating, had nothing to do with the fact that he cheated and basically maligned, millions of people in that contest. Nope. Doesn't matter that they lied about it for like a year. Nope. Doesn't matter any of that. Doesn't even matter that they got back on the stage and started saying, we're united when they weren't. None of that stuff is true. Olbermann's main point was, you just sold out your career by telling the truth that the Democratic Party cheated Sanders, something that was already exposed. It had nothing to do with the reality of it. It had nothing to do with the honesty of it. It had everything to do with power and who wins. And the catch is, he wanted his power or his particular party, the liberals, to have it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back for another open segment in a moment. You guys can reach us 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Is the left being unfair to AOC? Think about it.
Fault Lines.
Yo, Tashawn, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are still taking calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320, and the phone lines are open again, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I'm going to be a little bit of a dissident here, and thank you for the comments and the compliment, Anthony. I will surely disappoint you. Isn't this peanuts? Isn't what Jimmy Dore, like the option that he's talking about? This is a single vote. Say Pelosi puts the bill through. Lets the House vote. Isn't the House just going to vote no? Can't you reliably see it going that way? And then she is the enemy of whoever put her in that position, who held her against that margin. Isn't that like the almost inevitable outcome of this? What's your take, real quick?
I do agree with you that it's going to be a no. Meaning, like, even if they get what they want and they put it up, it's still a no. Besides the point, I think. The left has, for the last 40, 50 years, stood there, that cow, out in the rain that you kick, punch, slap, and everything else. And it stood there, regardless of what took place, regardless of the names that you call it, regardless of being told you have nowhere else. Meaning, it stayed in the party, even after being cheated, knowingly being cheated. It still voted for the people that cheated it. I'm trying to get across how pathetic the left can be on issues relating to the Democratic Party by not holding them accountable and not understanding.
But how does this help that?
Because it, at the very least, starts off with getting them to take a step that wasn't there prior. Like, it gets in the frame of mind of saying, do something, that you're standing there without using leverage, without flexing any capabilities at all, is worthless. You're not, meaning you need to be able to show some level of gains. And even if that gain is action, it's action.
But that would be a loss. But like we're saying, that would be a
Republicans
loss.
have pushed for Medicare for all, to get rid of Obamacare for like 50 times. It's still, the loss is not the main thing. The action is the point. action begets action.
Well, you just said it was a gain. No, you just said it was a gain. You didn't say it was a loss. If it's a gain, it can't be a loss. And if it's a loss, I don't see how that
Wait. Say it one more time.
advances
You said I called it a what? A gate?
a gain. You said it. It's a gain. Any action is a gain. That's the idea.
The technical vote is going to be a loss.
If you take an action and you lose, if you put a bill forward and then the House immediately shuts it down, that seems demotivating. That seems like a step in the wrong direction.
No,
I don't know,
disagree.
man. I mean, I'm not trying to shoot down the only positive recommendation here coming out of a major figure on, I guess, the political left. I would say that he's a political
lefty. He's on the left. I guess what I'm saying though, Shane, is the idea of waiting until you can do it and win it. And keep in mind, wins are different. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're in a debate, you could lose the debate but win in regards to what you're trying to accomplish. It depends on what you mean by win. There are different variations of a win. If I'm playing a grandmaster and I get a draw, I'm calling it a win. Is it a win? No. But the expectations make it so. Vietnam, was it a win for America? No, despite the number of people who died in Vietnam. I'm making the point, even this, same thing. Yes, you may technically lose the vote. That's fair enough. And Republicans lost Obamacare vote like 40 times. But there's something to be said for the left, finally, for the first time in God knows how long, taking an act. Because I think action begets actions. I think you take tactics, you take all sorts of maneuvers that injure or at the very least are annoying, but you flex your muscles. You get across that you exist. And not just you exist, you put everybody on the record for that vote in the middle of a pandemic, and you hold them to account for it. Meaning when you have all of these people, AOC, for example, perfect example. AOC, what is her main issue? One of the main issues, immigration. Green New Deal, immigration, and healthcare. AOC, Joe Biden, if you notice, immigration wasn't one of Joe Biden's main points. It came out in the media today that the reason is because basically he didn't like the aggressiveness from the Sunrise Movement and from some of these other groups and pushing him. So he basically kept it off the table. Even the notion of, hey guys, don't attack me that much. Even defund the police. You realize they're going around saying people like AOC was responsible for Democrats losing. Like, I guess we're trying to get across, Shane, that even if you technically lose the vote, from the politics of it, of having all of these lefties across the United States be able to run, if the left is right, and that the public actually does want Medicare for all to the tune of 88% among Democrats and 70% among the public, why wouldn't you have that as a point to attack Democrat leadership on and people who are backed by Democrat leadership on the thing as a vote that you can point to that those guys were against Medicare for? Like, I'm making a point that this is politics. And just because you lose technically on the vote doesn't necessarily mean that you don't lose in getting them to put the vote in the first place. That is leverage, that is power. And that is something that the politics or that the progressive left hasn't done in like 50 years. So even if it's a technical loss, I'm okay with it. It's the fact that it was done, that the leverage was being used, that it was being exerted, and that the left was willing to exert that leverage. I think that matters greatly, considering over the last 40, 50 years, this has been off the table entirely. What do you think? Do you think I'm entirely wrong, or a loss is a loss is a loss? It doesn't matter.
I'll put it like this. And I'm not saying this as a leftist. I'm saying this as somebody who sort of sympathizes in many capacities with the political left, but also with elements of the political right, the libertarians and such. If you have your foot stuck in a bear trap and the trap is closed and you're screaming in pain, and it's been a while, sort of the pain has subsided very slightly. You've developed the endorphins or whatever to keep it at bay. And every time you move, you feel that much more pain. At that point, unless you've got the strength to pull the bear trap apart, or unless somebody's going to come and rescue you, which I don't see anybody on the horizon right now, what you should think about are generally ways to, you're losing hydration, you're losing water, you need food, you need some way to get out of this trap. And maybe even you hear wolves off in the distance, something like this. You need some way to get out of that trap. Now, it seems like what you're saying, it's like it's a small move within the current political system. I'm worrying that that's just going to send another atrophy of shock through your system as you sort of struggle in that trap. Where what you could do, what you have access to, coincidentally, and this is getting really grisly really quickly, is you could just cut your leg off, pull out of the party, cauterize the wound, and struggle to move on, and then hope at some point somebody gives you a prosthetic leg or something. Now, that was unnecessarily morbid, and I hopefully didn't cause anybody some serious mental anguish there.
Way? Like
but is it?
He's trying to cut his arm off, and then he hits a nerve, and he's like, oh, that's too hot. And then he tries again. I guess I'm saying, don't you have to try at least to even get in your mindset that you're about to do?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's, here's the thing. it's a loss. And I don't see what's the strategy in which this sets you up for further gains. You're saying, you can lose a debate, but you might win something more important depending on how you lose that debate, or depending on the things that you say in that debate, depending on, what convictions you impress upon some members in the audience.
It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Like when Mike Pence went to debate Tim Kaine, Mike Pence had to deal with all of the stuff that Trump had been saying. And the thought was, Mike Pence, there's no way Mike Pence is going to get out of this debate. Mike Pence got out of that debate with people saying he seemed like a grandfather. Now, no, he didn't technically win it, because technically the debate was considered like a draw. But technically he did. I mean, in a way. Like, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. That's what I'm trying to get at from the standpoint of your
What are you trying
goal.
to what's the strategy here? That's where I was going. What is the next step? What's the sort of through line tactically and strategically by which this is going to accomplish some other important things? What comes after this?
It's not a strategy, it's a tactic. What I mean is it's a maneuver that sets you up for the standpoint of action. That's my point.
What action? What action?
You said
what does this set you up for? What is it?
I got to be honest.
What does this set you up
matter.
for?
Like the action. No, seriously. Think about what I'm telling you here. Think about what I'm telling you. Right. Moves in reality don't happen all at once. It's not this thing of you get everything you want with one shot. It very rarely works that way. If that was the case, Sanders would have won the presidency and we would have been, riding off to the history. Oftentimes you have to mitigate various things that happen because they don't tend to happen necessarily in the best or in the cleanest of ways. This is no different. The left has spent the longest time for the last 50 years in action. Taking in action in and of itself is productive, especially in the sense where the left hasn't done anything. Like, honestly, the very fact that this conversation is taking place is productive. I don't think you understand that. You're looking at it as it has to be one fell swoop. It doesn't work that way. I don't believe
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm asking for, here's the thing. I was saying this is a loss, and you're saying, okay, well, it might be a loss, but it would be a gain if it fits some larger trajectory, if it supports some other set. But then, when I just asked you,
action.
It's an action. Thank you.
Yes, I mean it's you have the argument that you're having now from a standpoint is basically do nothing or do something. The do nothing.
But this isn't the only thing you can do. This isn't the only thing you can do.
Shane, I'm not partial. It can be Medicare. It can be anything. I'm just saying do something. Oh. But go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting.
No, well, it's a false dichotomy between. I consistently am not like, yeah, guys, you should just quit the political system. I mean, me in the long run, I want to move on to a property because I'm broadly sick of the way that things are going as such. But I kind of veer between that, just speaking personally, between thinking that and thinking, okay, maybe there are some opportunities for me to fit myself into this, to make some larger change. Maybe I can make some good happen despite the wide-scale apparent collapse of our political system and the hopes of our society, et cetera, et cetera. That's just me personally. But I can kind of see that same dynamic playing out with a lot of people. Having said that, broadly on this show, I'm not like, you just quit the race, you stop running, you stop caring. I consistently stress people should try to create local networks. People should aim for direct action in productive capacities, building up their local communities, getting involved in local politics, because in the long run, that creates a sort of grassroots basis, that creates a long-term basis that with the power of your own nets on the internet might actually do some good on a national level. But at the very least, it's getting you engaged in creating sort of local power in your communities. That's sort of where I come from. That's my action. I think that's a lot more productive than for one thing, here's the thing is I can see the option tree. Jimmy Dore and if other leftists call on the squad to take this action against Nancy Pelosi. And if the squad doesn't do that, well, then you've learned something about the squad, I guess. If the squad does it and Nancy Pelosi refuses and is not reelected as Speaker of the House, then you learn something there. And if she brings it to a vote, if she gets her reelection, whatever, if she pushes the vote into the House and it gets voted on, it's going to get voted no. Here's the thing. All three of those, I actually don't see what you gain from that. You kind of already can see how each one of those steps is going to go. You have already in advance, you've learned the lesson that you would learn on the other side of every one of those options. Am I making any sense here?
Not entirely. Because I think it misses tactics. I mean, for example, if you honestly believe, meaning if in lefty heads, that Medicare for All has 88% support. And by the way, I say this because I think you can do multiple things at once. I'm not a Democrat or part of the Democratic Party, but I do think you can do multiple things at once. You can walk and chew gum. I don't see anything wrong with getting activity or lefties into their head action. And one action precipitates another, inevitably. it's opportunity, and it's trying to use the leverage and opportunity, knowing that the moment Pelosi gets in, you're not going to get anything you want. Biden was proof of that. But let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming up, headlines, last hour. Back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our divided states, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Bridging the gap, bridging the chasm. In the headlines this morning, in the news, first of nearly 3 million doses were sent across the United States yesterday, marking the start of the most ambitious vaccination campaign in the nation's history. Early on Sunday, the first boxes of a vaccine delivered by Pfizer and BioNTech that received emergency approval from federal regulators were packed in dry ice at a Pfizer plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Workers applauded as the first truck left the plant, the earliest wave of vaccines bound for distribution sites across all 50 states. The first doses will go to healthcare workers who could start receiving shots by Monday. Residents of nursing homes who have suffered a disproportionate share of COVID-19 deaths are also being prioritized and are expected to begin getting vaccinations next week. Hospitals rushed to set up injection sites, and workers tracked each shipment hour by hour. More than a quarter of the deaths above normal this year have been from other causes than COVID-19, including a 15% rise in deaths from diabetes, a 13% rise in deaths from Alzheimer's disease, and 11% rises in deaths from high blood pressure and pneumonia. This is according to a New York Times analysis of estimates from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's thought that many of these excess deaths were caused either by less willingness to seek out medication from groups with relevant conditions or a lack of options for treatment, particularly in the cases of victims of Alzheimer's disease, many of whom would have been living in nursing homes. And again, of course, nursing homes not shut down, but capacity severely reduced in terms of the number of people who were in them, just a lot of people dying. And you can imagine intense isolation, including from your families. That's a stressful event. And if you're, in a state of sort of chronic neurological degeneration, that's not going to help that condition. Sad to say. So sort of silent lives of despair in some cases this year. Not a good picture. Anyway, nationally in political news, Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post has reported that APT-29, which some intelligence communities have linked to Russian security services, have breached the Treasury and Commerce departments along with other U.S. government agencies through the update server of a company called SolarWinds, which runs network management systems and is sort of an umbrella company that has acquired a bunch of other companies over the years, widely used. The National Security Council reportedly convened an emergency meeting to discuss the breach on Saturday. NSC spokesman John Olyat said that they, quote, are aware of these reports, and we are taking all necessary steps to identify and remedy any possible issues related to this situation, end quote. The alleged hack comes following reports last week that FireEye, a major U.S. cybersecurity firm, had been attacked by a nation with top-tier offensive capabilities, quote unquote, which was said to have made off with its internal hacking tools. FireEye did not attribute that attack to APT-29, although Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post did later the same day. I keep bringing her up because she's a consistent author, consistent journalist in these stories. Back to 2016, I think it was in June or July of 2016, that the first story about cyberstrike and the DNC started coming out. And if I remember correctly, it was Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post who was reporting on that one. appears to have built up a wide network of intelligence professionals in a Rolodex, something like that, because she consistently quotes them anonymously. That seems to be the basis of a lot of her articles on this stuff. I want to come back to one of the first things I said. This is, about most of the official headlines on this story. A lot of folks have associated APT-29 with Russian security services, but it doesn't make sense to me. If you go back and look at the earliest stages of this, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that Russian security services would do. First of all, back in 2014, Kaspersky was reporting on this. Russians were among the first who were hacked by this alleged group. We don't even know that this is a group. The assumption here, based on the malware that's used, and I believe the servers that are used, which in many cases anybody can hire out these servers. They're publicly available through sort of companies that rent them out. Anybody can do that. They link them together based on assumed motivations. But again, if you go back to 2014, some of the first victims of attacks associated with this alleged group were in Russia. Most of them, in fact. If you go back in 2014, you can find it through Wikipedia, a Kaspersky article on some of the earliest attacks here. Again, most of the victims were in Russia, and then it was in other countries, not all of which you would assume to be opposed to Russia. Anyway, a lot more to say on this. I want to get a guest on, though. Sadly, it's actually kind of hard in my experience to find guests who are both knowledgeable about the relevant stuff, like deeply knowledgeable about cybersecurity, and who are willing to speak out about this. Remember this a couple of years ago when I was doing this research with my dad, former host of the show. You would consistently find that even though folks privately or even publicly thought that it didn't make sense, thought that the way that they were alleging this stuff, the way that they were building up their cases, the circumstantial evidence they were using to make their case, it didn't all line up. They often weren't willing to actually talk about it. And that was even before we were working with Sputnik. Anyway, at least 4 people were stabbed and 23 were arrested in Washington, D.C. during the Saturday Stop the Steal March, an event organized in opposition to the outcome of this year's presidential election. Protesters and counter-protesters clashed violently in the streets. The Proud Boys made an appearance. In fact, they're what we were focusing on in our interview with Wyatt Reed, Sputnik producer. You can go back and listen to that. Aired at 8:15 a.m. Eastern, 5:15 a.m. Pacific, during the 6th segment of this show. In international news, following a call with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on Sunday that the UK was prepared for a no-deal Brexit, arguing that there was, quote, clarity, end quote, and simplicity in the move. And there certainly is, but many think that's a dead end. I don't know, Jamarl. I don't follow this stuff too closely. It's certainly interesting to learn about. What's your take on what's going to happen? You're muted. I heard you come in for a sec, but you got to press the button again, Jamarl.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that last part one more time.
Just what do you reporting on Boris Johnson?
Yeah, the UK
prepared for a no-deal Brexit. Exactly. Arguing there's clarity and simplicity. What's your take?
Well, it sounds like they are going to still continue with the negotiations going past. I honestly don't think either side wants a no deal. By the same token, both sides, look, in any negotiation, there has to be levels of existence you're willing to accept. Otherwise, you're stuck with whatever you get. Meaning, if Bojo, for example, Jeremy Corbyn is I'm going to get a deal regardless. Then they can give you basically the exact same deal that they gave Theresa May. What are you going to do? Leave? You've just said you can't leave. So there has to be levels of existence, whether it's the EU or the UK. The catch is, neither wants a no deal. Neither does. By the same token, both have to be willing to accept it. And so you get this kind of brinksmanship that goes on both sides up until the point of trying to show, how strong and willing you are to go and that type of stuff. But at the end of the day, the EU, I don't think is better with Britain collapsing on its borders, nor do I think the UK is better collapsing on the borders of the EU. So I do think these guys are going to try to get a deal at the very end. Despite all of this rancor and back and forth, the belligerence is just part of the negotiation. That's how I see it. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. I think that's exactly how it's going to go.
We'll see. Big moves here, regardless. And it's interesting to see. I've just seen some high-profile people come out this year and say, well, I used to oppose Brexit. I'm not actually sure that it's such a bad idea at this point. I'm not going to name names, but I've seen a couple of them, economists. Anyway, the United Nations Refugee Agency said it has received an overwhelming number of reports about Eritrean refugees in Tigray being killed, abducted, or forcibly returned to Eritrea since fighting in Ethiopia's northernmost region began And more than a month ago, again, Tigray on the border with Eritrea. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and other aid agencies have not had access to the 4 main camps hosting Eritrean refugees inside Tigray since fighting erupted in early November between the government and the region's former ruling political body, that's the TPLF, or the Tigray People's Liberation Front. The army under Ethiopia's President Abiy Ahmed has captured the regional capital of Mekelle and declared victory, but TPLF leaders said they are fighting back on various fronts around the highland city. Most communications in Tigray are down and access to the area is severely restricted, making it hard to verify either side's statements. In British news, author of espionage novels David Cornwell, better known by his pen name John le Carré, died on Saturday in Cornwall, England at the age of 89. The cause was pneumonia. That's according to his publisher Penguin Random House, saying this on Sunday. He was a former secret agent. He was best known for his spy novels that upturned contemporary views of espionage as prestigious in favor of a morally ambiguous satirical indictment of the nature of spycraft. His books include The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, The Looking Glass War, and Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, all of which have been adapted for film. More than 300 schoolboys are still missing after gunmen attacked a secondary school in Kankara, a town in Nigeria's northwestern Katsina state, according to authorities there. Attackers on motorcycles stormed the all-boys government science school late on Friday and engaged security forces in a gun battle, forcing hundreds of students to flee and hide in the surrounding forest. So far, we are yet to account for 333 people. That is Katsina's governor, Aminu Masari, saying that on Sunday after a meeting with security officials, adding that the boarding school had a total of 839 students. That would put it at well over a third of the students total currently unaccounted for, possibly kidnapped. In a related headline, jihadists from Boko Haram have killed at least 27 people in an attack of quote-unquote unprecedented savagery in southeast Niger, local officials said on Sunday. Other people were wounded and some reported missing in the assault on Saturday evening in the village of Tumor in the Difa region, said a senior local official. Witnesses and other officials confirmed the attack, which came hours before municipal and regional elections went ahead across the country on Sunday. Between 800 and 1,000 houses, the central market, and numerous vehicles were also destroyed in the fire. Roughly 70 attackers arrived at Tumor on foot, having swum across Lake Chad. The attack itself lasted for 3 hours and destroyed nearly 60% of the village. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Interesting to note, this is partly my choice, but two of the three stories there, and this is partly I was listening to different sources, listening to BBC News. Two of the three stories having to do with Africa there have to do with jihadist attacks. That is a sort of like oft unreported element of what I would argue are American-supported Islamist groups. A lot of the folks who get hurt by those groups are in Africa, and we don't really report on that as much. The United States, I mean. So some other international outlets like Deutsche Welle or the BBC will occasionally touch on it. France, Niger, former French colony, first language there as far as I know, still French. They'll report on that sometimes. We won't, which is doubly sad, of course, because again, we backed like Al-Qaeda, we backed other Islamist groups, backed ISIS affiliates in Syria and in the region. So we're sort of, planting the seeds, and then other countries are having to reap the bloody harvest. Anyway, Jamarl, we're going into a break in a minute. What's your take? You follow those issues?
Well, I try to keep track of what's going on abroad, just from the show's standpoint, as you're covering the news. I think one of the weirder aspects of this is Europe's behavior to me. Europe is very strange. Like, the EU is a massive continent, of course, or a massive body of, let's say, human beings. Let's not call them a continent. And the United States and the militaristic actions that we take around the world, especially in the Middle East, under Bush, under Obama, created massive refugees. Those refugees from Syria, from Libya, from these countries, flooded into Europe. They didn't flood into America. Like, they didn't get into a rowboat and paddle all the way to America. No, they flooded into the closest place, which was Europe. When Germany was getting like the million refugees and whatnot, when these countries were getting these refugees, what happened? The politics of the countries destabilized. And when the politics destabilized, you had more right-wingers, more hawkish governments that basically said, we need public relations people to keep these immigrants from coming out the country or get them out the country. Boris Johnson, one of the main things he used was immigration. One of the main things that was used in some of the other countries to get in power was immigration. And so it's like Europe being destabilized by this looks like it will be far more, what's the word I'm looking for, against? Far more pushback on U.S. behavior in this region, even with Iran. Like, if there was a war between Iran and the United States, what does Europe think is going to take place in that? And does Europe think that's going to be in its best interest any more than it was from the standpoint of the other people being killed? No, I think it's very bizarre. Europe's response in the immigration stuff is very strange, especially when dealing with the United States. I think all of this is strange. It's unfortunate. And I often question, this goes into something you say. What is the social dynamic? Like, what is the technology socially from the standpoint of the way people think, from the way we interact with the world to prevent behavior like this? Whether it's us calling for military strikes when Trump first got in, killing a 13-year-old and that child dying and bleeding to death at 13 for 2 hours, or this. And so, all of it brings me qualms, and I do wish we focus on this stuff, but we tend not to. And like you said, Africa is not a continent we'd all that much focus on it, with the exception of the Middle East. Let's do this. If you guys this is Fault Lines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Stranahan and Luongo. We are joined by our guest, Tom Luongo, for this segment and the next. He is a geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. And by the way, you can and you should follow Tom on Twitter at TFL1728. Read his articles at luongo.me and subscribe to his monthly newsletter on Patreon at patreon.com, Gold, Goats, and Guns. That is an N as in the letter N, just the letter there, Gold, Goats, and Guns. Anyway, Tom Luongo, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, guys. How are you?
All right. Better for having you. Let's talk about Merkel and Germany for a second. We're actually just talking about the European Union more broadly as it relates to the United States largely support of jihadists overseas and the sort of weird boomerang effect that's having. Not weird. The boomerang effect that's having on Africa, and how the European Union might have some interest there. Of course, the refugee crisis, the migration crisis, that's a big thing in European politics and in world politics, frankly. But we're also coming off of a pandemic here, and I'll start it off like this. Great reset, hard Brexit, economic catastrophes or crises of various scales. If you can see Brexit as an economic catastrophe, it's certainly a crisis for the EU in its way. Combine that with the refugee crisis, the migration crisis. What's your picture of the European Union in the 2020s over the next decade?
A mess. Merkel started this process back in 2015 or so with the refugee crisis under orders from the people that she works for to flood the zone with refugees and destabilize as many of the countries as possible. And it's all downstream of the U.S. policy in Syria, which the EU signed on to. Everybody signed on to the operation in Syria by the Obama administration back in 2013, which the Russians have done their level best to put the brakes on. And Syria is still going to wind up being, ultimately, I think, wind up being the graveyard of U.S. foreign policy empire, not Afghanistan. I think Syria is actually the key to this whole thing, though Afghanistan is certainly a a contributing factor and, the pullout from Afghanistan, a symptom of a larger problem. But Europe has real problems. They're trying desperately to integrate at a fiscal level, because the fundamental problem with the European Union as a union is that they have no, I've said this before, they have no single source of debt issuance. Here in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve, right? And we have the U.S. Treasury Department. And they're the only way to make new dollars is to go through the Fed and the Treasury, right? The Treasury asks, the Treasury wants to raise money, and the Fed backstops all the auction sales, and that's the way it is. In Europe, every individual central bank does the same thing, and they do so at different rates, and they do so with different risk profiles and the whole nine yards. And the euro as a currency trades based on the perception as to whether or not Germany will backstop all of this, because Germany is the strongest economic and political entity in Europe. So really the European Union, when it comes down to it, is Germany's playground. So when you think of it in those terms, and then you think about what Angela Merkel is doing now, which is to hard lock down the entire country again, and then you have to ask yourself, well, why would she do that, knowing how badly the German economy has already suffered? And that's not just including from the refugee crisis itself, which nearly cost her job, but the ridiculous sanctions on Europe, on Russia, which have cost German industries billions of dollars a year, going back to 2014, when they put sanctions on for the outgrowth of the Ukrainian civil war and the Russia's reunification with Crimea, right? When you put all that together, you're like, Merkel is literally burning the bridges with the very people who keep her in power, the whole German industrial base, while she courts the Greens to support the Great Reset, who are her political allies in the Bundesrat, right, in the German higher house, the higher German legislative house, the Bundesrat, the equivalent kind of our U.S. Senate. So why would all this go on? Like, why is she doing any of this? Well, it's because the goal is actually to destroy the middle class in Europe. The goal of the Great Reset is to destroy the lower and middle classes and roll all the wealth up into the largest of companies, and at the same time put controls on the companies who have benefited the most so far from the corona apocalypse, which is Amazon, Google, Apple, blah, blah, blah. And I saw this morning that we're looking at potentially billions and up to 10% of revenue in new taxes that the European Union is going to want to levy on all the big tech firms who are going to be crying in 6 to 8 months when they realize just how badly they've been had. So that's what I think is going on in Europe is Germany is moving to consolidate power over the EU in order to consolidate debt issuance under the euro, and create a more perfect economic and political union. Okay, they failed to get Hungary and Poland to sign on to this, and George Soros is hopping mad. If you haven't read the article that he published in Project Syndicate the other day, because Viktor Orban stood his ground and won, the prime minister of Hungary, and they've kicked the can down the road because Merkel is actually a lot weaker than she appears to be, but she's moved in many, many ways to consolidate power in Germany and to play everybody off of each other, including the United States and Russia, for her benefit and for their benefit. So I have a very complicated view of all this, and I haven't even touched on about half of what I'd actually like to say, but I'll stop now.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so there's a lot there to unpack. I need you to first explain the Great Reset. God, there's a lot there to unpack. You said a lot, Tom. First,
I know I did.
I agree with you with the euro thing. I think the euro. Let's start there for a moment. The euro and the way it's constructed doesn't entirely make a lot of sense. I mean, you have some countries that don't necessarily have a strong, let's say, economic base, and all of that stuff gets merged into one currency that countries don't own. So under normal circumstances, like states in the United States, they basically trying to turn countries into states, but they are not states. They're countries, right? They have their own. Right. They're supposed to have their own fiscal issues. So if they wanted to expand the money that they were putting out in order to deal with immigrants or COVID, they could do that. But the problem is, they're not their own countries. What's the argument? Before going into the Great Reset stuff, there's an argument that's put forth that I think I actually agree with, that the euro was constructed by people who basically wanted to get these countries in the Europe together, meaning it wanted to drag these things ever closer and ever closer, understanding that the euro was always going to fall apart because the euro wasn't constructed under this notion that this is a great idea. It was more so constructed that in order to fix the euro, especially when you're 40 years in, let's say, you have to get closer together, meaning you almost have to federalize in order to deal with the crisis that the euro presents in and of itself. So we know, meaning European people, the founders, when they were constructing the economic consortium, we know that we can't drag these countries together if we just put it up for a vote. We do know that if we get them down the line, they don't have a choice but to either break up, something that it will be economically painful, i.e. UK, or you stay together and you get closer. What do you think about that? Do you think that has legs?
Do I think it was purposeful, or do I think it was just that was the best plan that they can cobble together? From what I've heard, listening to various people who have who've been able to peek behind the scenes. Right, I've read Bernard Connolly's The Rotten Heart of Europe. I've talked to people who know, and I've listened to Martin Armstrong talk. I've talked to people who know, who knew Margaret Thatcher and knew these people while the European Union was being put together. And my research and my take on this is that this was the best they could put together, and that at the end of the day, if they could create a political union first and then use the political union as a hammer, and I will say sickle, to create their ultimate goal, then that's the choice they had to make. Because remember, they only put the European Union membership and Euro membership in front of people where they thought they could, as elections or referenda, where they thought they could win. And then when they didn't win, they forced them to, vote again and everything else. Germany was never given any choice in the matter. Okay? It was either Helmut Kohl or I think it was Helmut Kohl just moved them in. And then after he was done and after he left, he said, look, if I had put it to a vote, they would have never voted for it. So I just have to do it. And effectively did it via, for lack of a better term, it's not completely, but, via executive order. So and the whole European Union doesn't exist without Germany. Okay. And so the price for that, for getting Germany involved in that, was that Germany would always be able to run a mercantilist export model on the rest of Europe, right? By using a euro that is undervalued versus what a Deutschmark would be, versus an overvalued euro versus what an Italian lira would be, to ultimately create a wealth transfer system that would eventually suck up all the capital out of Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and all the rest of them into Germany's coffers. And at the same time, the ECB and the European Union officials, the Troika, every time there was any kind of sovereign debt crisis or any kind there was a problem, they would force Germany to the point where they would have to backstop the problem. So we have massive Target 2 imbalances and all these other things, right? So that's where we are today. Now, whether that was purposeful or not, that's a good question. I'm going to say it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I have to take the over on government incompetence, right? As opposed to bet on Snidely Whiplash and the twirling mustaches. There's a part of me that believes both are equally real. I think people are just really good at seizing opportunities. Okay. And it's the same thing with COVID. Part of me wants to believe this is all a directed operation, intelligence operation. I think part of it actually is. But then another part of me just says, look, people are just really good at taking opportunities to seize power when it's presented to them. And, the people who set these things in motion know that as well. And so there's all of this stuff going on. It's very, very difficult to unpack. And it's almost impossible to communicate to anybody who's even remotely willing to understand it. Right. And while the real problem here is that everybody's losing their freedom at a level that none of us expected could even think was going to happen, within, the 12-month span. These people are talking about, mandatory vaccinations and in order to even have a life. And we've gone there in less than 12 months. That should frighten everybody, in every way, regardless of your political persuasion.
No, that part I agree with you on, Tom. I mean, I don't want anybody forcing anything in.
It's not just the vaccine. The vaccine is a metaphor. Okay. Jamarl. I mean, my point is that even the vaccine itself is a metaphor, and election fraud is a metaphor for the level of power and concentration and opportunity these people are willing to take and the risks they're willing to take to force upon us a particular system that we don't want simply because they have political power and they think we don't. And what we're seeing in all of these popular uprisings around the world, around Europe and the United States, is that. And we need to take our partisan blinders off here, regardless of who we think actually won the election or anything like that, and look seriously at what's actually being done here. Because if we do not come up with some coordinated way to start pushing back against this stuff, it's the 2022 is going to look like an episode of Black Mirror crossed with Minority Report, and there's not anything a lot of us can do about it.
Yeah,
and that's what scares me.
I agree with you on Tom. I mean, look, I don't buy the election stuff at all. I don't think. I mean, Trump lies as easily as he breathes, and I don't necessarily see it. If you got it, show it. But the Minority Report stuff, yes. The freedom stuff, meaning from standpoint of laws and bills that they put into place that you're watched everywhere you go, and that stuff I think is legit, especially the merger between tech and politics. And maybe that's an interesting conversation to have about the dystopian nature of what this is going to look like in a few years. This is Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back after this.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. By the way, just a quick reminder, you can call in anytime you want to. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Feel free to call in now. We also have an open segment next segment, but if you want to join this conversation with Tom, you can do so. Again, 202-521-1320. Tom, talking about the Great Reset, I want to come back to Klaus Schwab for just a second, World Economic Forum. A lot was made of this dude. News has died down slightly. I'm still a little bit incredulous, but I want to hear you build it up. The fourth industrial revolution to me seems neither particularly industrial nor like a revolution. It seems like a milquetoast continuation of longstanding policies, a sort of neoliberal global encroachment. Admittedly, the pandemic is giving an opportunity for large corporations to consolidate their power. And I hear you on hollowing out the middle class. A couple of different ways we can take this, but one way, I'm going to start this off. What happened to not Fordism, particularly, but generally the idea that what you want is for the public to have money that they can then be marketed to spend on goods that you, the industrial magnate, make? What happened to that idea? Why has that died out? What has happened to the middle class that was supposed to have built? What's been the sort of sea change in economic policy that has eroded that foundation? Where do you see us now as opposed to there?
I see them as completely hostile to it. I think the left has been hostile to it. And I mean this broadly, going back to the progressive era. They've been broadly hostile to it forever because this is an ideological fight here, right? Between the ideas of equality as egalitarianism and i.e. outcome, and equality of possibility, right? Quality of potential, for lack of a better term. And my fundamental problem has always been with those on the left various stripes is that they don't understand the basics of the marginal utility and the marginal increase and burden that it takes every time you put a small barrier up in front of what looks like a small barrier to a middle class or to an upper class individual, $25 for a property tax increase or whatever the heck it is, that's a massive marginal increase to those of the lower strata because they have less money. And so the more barriers like that, no matter how small they are, the more barriers you put up, the harder it is for there to be any kind of social class mobility. And therefore, over time, what you wind up with is this, ever gradiating system where the rich get richer and the poor don't. And, constant capital concentrates at the top of the society. And, it doesn't matter if you have a progressive or regressive income tax system or anything else. It's always that way. And my fundamental problem is that we have people who are, and I know I'm not really kind of answering a question here, but I kind of had to back up to make sure we understood, like basic terms of where I'm coming from. That has been the overriding principle of we want to create a fairer world, but we implement systems that are fundamentally unfair, and then we complain that those systems don't create the outcomes that we want, even though the critics of that system told you from the beginning, by the way, those outcomes are not going to come out of that policy. This is what's going to happen. This is what you're hope to happen. They never meet, and then we keep believing the experts who are trotted out in front of us every day. And this is what's happening with COVID. It's what's happening with, and the whole world is being run in a kind of intelligence operation, I believe, that enshrines low quality information as gospel truth and then just keeps spreading it. And now we have better tools to do that than we ever had in the past, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. And the truth is that the systems themselves that have been created to this point are failing. Okay. And so people like Klaus Schwab and the rest of them and the rest of the oligarchs that surround him know that the system is going to fail. They can't issue much more debt. Right? We're near debt saturation. They're going to have to repudiate the debt. They're going to have to do something. So their plan is to destroy the lower and middle classes and then build them back up through universal basic income and turn everybody into perfect consumers like they are in the Pixar movie WALL-E, which is your best kind of visual reference of the people kind of sitting in lounge chairs waiting to be able to go back to the world that they destroyed through consumerism, right? Drinking sodas and eating cheeseburgers and watching nonsense on TV. That's the world they envisioned for us. If you listen to them carefully, they'll tell you the truth. They'll tell you what their plans are. It's never particularly hard. And I don't know that they were saying that explicitly in WALL-E. I think it was more of a commentary on that potential world, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, that's what I think that's exactly what they have planned for us. And I think Klaus Schwab is a very dangerous man. And I think that the people that he has working for him are equally dangerous. And I also think that everybody's particular agendas, right, feed into all of this, right? And this goes back, this has been ground that's been prepared ideologically and rhetorically for 70 to 80 years now. I mean, I say this all the time, Shane. I'm a libertarian, but Marxism is the dominant political philosophy of the age, right? I don't see how we could argue otherwise.
Tom, just so I'm clear, I got to interrupt.
So
Obama gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. How on earth is Marxism the dominant? But come on. I mean, you have basically business owners.
I think you're misunderstanding my point. It's the dominant. No, I think you're missing my point.
Tom, I'll let you talk for a while.
No. I'm not. This is
I just wanted to inject for a moment.
We understand that it doesn't matter. Yeah, he is. Obama's a Marxist. And guess what? The communist revolution is predicated on destroying the middle class and the lower classes and rolling up what's left of the wealth to the oligarchy. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. It's what happened in Germany. It's what happened in Cambodia. It's what happened everywhere.
You believe it's the communists and the socialists that are basically running the United States for the last 50 years? Just to nail it down. I just want to be specific.
I think if you look at our policy and you look at the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, I think the United States runs like 7 or 8 of them.
It's because it's a mixed economy. All economies are mixed economies.
But the point I'm making to you
is,
listen to
what you're saying, Tom.
From a libertarian perspective, dude. If you don't think that we don't enshrine Marxism in our
No,
educational, the way we educate children.
No, I don't.
I saw this stuff back in the 70s.
No, I don't.
And
It's the
80s
opposite.
when I was being a kid. So look, what I'm saying is it's not that everybody believes it in a doctrinaire fashion. What I'm saying is that it has been in every way the dominant filter by which we prosecute both political and economic systems. Keynesianism is very close to Marxism.
Okay.
There's not much difference here.
I mean,
From
there
a
is
free
a
market
difference.
perspective, it's a terrible thing.
Keynesianism, for one, doesn't necessarily have workers owning the means of production. Marxism does. As for the dominant economic system in the country, the dominant economic system in the country is and has been the capitalistic system, where business owners, oligarchs, whatever, kind of rig the system in their interests. And I think that's regardless of political parties. It may come as a different flavor. Don't misunderstand me. But I think the modus operandi is insane. I don't buy the Marxism stuff in the background. I think it's people who have issues of power. They have leeway, they have clout, they have the capability to take advantage of situations like either COVID or, like you said, the immigration thing. And they try to move the laws to their interests. I don't think you need a grand conspiracy for that. I really do believe that individual actors trying to push for their own ends in the system itself gets back or explains the system. I mean, I know you're using the Marxism stuff, and I know you're looking at this from the standpoint of a libertarian, but you don't see where I'm coming from at all, saying it seems like people with means are basically just rigging the rules in their interests, and the ideology part is just kind of the overlay that allows them the excuse to do it, whether you're in the EU or whether you're in the United States. And I would say the political parties, to some degree, are just representations of that, depending upon the flavor of color or the team or the tribe that you're with. But the end goal is the same. Like, I don't think this is a political party thing. I mean, or do you? I mean, do you believe I'm entirely wrong on that front?
Political parties come into this. I said Marxism is the dominant political philosophy of the age, and it's infected everybody's friggin' thinking. That does not mean that we practice Marxism. There's a fundamental difference between those two things, between specification and implementation. What you wind up with is a system that's a hybrid of all of this stuff, but while it's inexorably moving towards where we are today, because if you're going to argue that the Great Reset is not communism 3.0, I don't know what else to tell you. You will own nothing and you will love it. Like, this is what I'm talking about. They've been working towards this assiduously for years. We don't have capitalism in the United States. We have corporatism. We have almost the perfect form of corporatism, which is Mussolini's fascism or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's all collectivism anyway. But it's been done, and it's been erected slowly but surely, and in bits and places and here and there, in order to create in order to bring about this kind of situation today. Okay, and it gets done bits and pieces. It gets done with that philosophy in mind. Why we should have a progressive income tax system. Why we should have we should have a central bank. We should have all of these things. These are all hallmarks of no generational wealth. We had look, dude. We had the world's most punitive friggin' estate tax in the world for how many years? That's not a Marxist idea. Because we want to destroy generational wealth. You might agree with it, but it's still a Marxist idea. Like, are you going to deny that basic concept? Because if we're going to deny basic freaking terms, I don't need to come on the show. I'm dead serious here. This is dumb.
Tom, are you serious? You're angry about me pushing back on your commentary? I let you talk for the overwhelming majority of the time. I push back on something that I disagree with, and your response to this is, "Well, I don't have to come back on the show." That's your choice, Tom. Honestly, nobody has said anything off to you. Nobody has treated you poorly. We've given you the floor to have the conversation that you wanted. If you're going to take that stance, you can take that stance. You can leave now, as far as I'm concerned. You weren't mistreated on the show, so don't act like you were.
The name of the show is Fault Lines. Name of the show is Fault Lines. We try to bring opposite sides together. This is what happens. I mean, there's magma. It gets fiery, but frankly, I think it's worth it. Because at the end of the day, if you can come to some constructive dialogue, you can produce something out of the conversation. You don't have to agree with each other. In fact, you shouldn't. But ideally, you're able to come together. You're able to have those conversations. Because if we aren't, that seems like a deeper level of social erosion. I don't know how to get past it.
Okay, my point here to Jamarl is very simple. He took exception to me saying that communism, which is literally all over the 20th century, killed 250 million people, right? Moved heaven and earth, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Cambodia, name them, right? Moved heaven and earth. And now we're at the moment where this great reset is in front of us, and these people are saying the same thing. And we have all the hallmarks of that embedded in even the most liberal of quote unquote capitalist democracies. And you're not telling me it's the most dominant political ideology of the age? I'm not saying that.
Is it fair?
Hey, that's nonsense.
That's ridiculous, Tom.
No, so
Communism is the
here's my
dominant
take.
political thing of the age. Honestly, that's where you're standing on that. And look, I'll let you finish it.
I would say,
it's communism.
Wait, can I come in for a minute?
Go for it, Shane.
Can I come in? Thank you. Yeah, because I've this whole segment I've really just sort of spectated, and at the end I tried to come in to try to mediate the tiniest bit. But it seems to me like for the last century at least we've been stuck in the spectrum between communism and capitalism, or more recently would be social capitalism. And if you view that as a spectrum that is on its own axis, and there's another axis of power, when they come together at the peak of power, what you get is fascism, the sort of top of the pyramid. What you get with the joint union of communism and capitalism is what Tom called, I think accurately, corporatism, where the vehicle of the state is driven by capital interests, and at the same time, the wealth of the public in general is expropriated. It seems like that's a fair description of the system that we and many other countries around the world are living under. And I guess my only thing here is that it's on the spectrum between capitalism and communism. And when you get the union of the two, when they come together, what you get is power to the nth degree, to a massively accelerated degree. Anyway, I don't mean to cut us off. We've got to go into a break pretty much here. Tom, I just want to thank you for joining us. Interesting conversation. Certainly got fiery there at the end, but appreciate you being willing to have it with us.
Sure. Have a good day now, guys.
You too. All right, for those listening, that was the voice of Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. You can follow Tom on Twitter at TFL1728, read his articles at tomluongo.me, and subscribe to his monthly newsletter on Patreon at patreon.com/gold, goats, and guns. Jamarl, thank you for having that conversation too. We're going to be back in a minute. Taking calls, 202-521-1320 is the number you can call if you want to join the show. And I'm hoping and assuming some folks will want to join the show after, at the very least, that last conversation. Again, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. We've already got a few callers, in the dock, but we have room for more. Again, 202-521-1320. Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you are on the line. What's going on, man?
Hey, good morning, guys. That was a great conversation. I hope that Tom would return and come back for more conversations. I think that I was calling earlier for a different point, but I think that I get that words matter, terms matter, stuff like that, especially like I'm gonna cut to it. We're at a point now where we literally have a gun in our face, right? And it's great to make sure that we have the understanding that the proper terms are being used and the proper categories and all of this stuff, right? But I think, and this crosses over to even the conversation earlier about the AOC thing. I think that it's most important that we realize that something is going on here, that we realize that we are at a very crucial moment, and that people act. Right? Like going to the AOC thing and Jimmy Dore's point on that, it's more a matter of acting, getting the people to stand up and take action, whether they're going to win, lose, or anything, because so far you're just being pushed, you're being bullied, and The progressives aren't doing anything. The people are frustrated. They're boiling over, and they feel like no one's hearing them. So when we're calling into the show, the people that's listening to the show, and not just your show, all of these independent media programs, most people are calling in because or listening because they feel like they're backed up against the wall and they know something needs to be done, and they're hoping that these are the outlets that are going to, organize them or something. And the truth of the matter is that most of these shows are maybe just reporting and trying to put out information that's not being put out. But you have to realize the people that are calling in are looking for more. They're looking for movement. They're looking for action. And some people take this thing as a deadly serious point. And I think that's where you get the intensity from Tom Luongo. I may not agree with everything he's saying, but I do know that the Great Reset is something that's real. I do know that Klaus Schwab is very dangerous. And I do know that we at some point have to move from just conversations and categorizing and start taking action. So I get the sensitivity of the matter, and I get the tempers on both sides. I just think that arguing over what the classification is very small, and then you lose the actual target, which is that putting the act.
Brave, there's no argument on my side. Like, if you look at the video, I had no feelings about the conversation at all up until the point Tom throws a hissy fit saying that he's not going to come back on the show if I don't agree with him or some nonsense. No, I mean, it's fault lines. There are going to be disagreements in regards to perspectives. It just kind of is what it is. There can be all sorts of things you can agree with me on. I get to disagree with 1,000 times a day on my show. I mean, you can't take this perspective that if you don't agree with what I just said, that somehow I'm going to flip out. I don't buy that. Like, and for me, I'm just basically talking to him. I'm letting him talk. I'm not interrupting him. I'm not stopping him. It only was towards the last part was like, all right, Tom, you talked for like 2 minutes. I disagree with this. And he loses it. I mean, I feel you, Brave. Look, I don't think people should be running off misinformation. That's the first point. Meaning action, yes, but it shouldn't necessarily be off something that's just entirely wrong. The idea that the Proud Boys are out there screaming that the election was rigged, for example, functioning or acting off of misinformation. At least I think so. On the other part to that, look, I get it. I feel you, man. I get you, Brave. I get where you're coming from. Yes, I think things need to take place, actions that takes place. Yes, I think people should think about what that action is. No, I don't think it should take place on misinformation. And no, political parties, especially people with, just because, you can't necessarily tell what's going on behind the scenes,